Somewhere off the coast of Iran, a U.S. Navy radio operator hears the same sentence twice in a row, spoken in a voice that isn't asking. This is the last warning. This is the last warning. It comes over the open channel as two American destroyers, the USS Michael Murphy and the USS Frankie Petersen, push toward the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. And here's what makes this moment strange enough to still be talked about months later. Instead of turning back, instead of going quiet, the crew on those destroyers does something that naval officers almost never do. They flip on their tracking system, out in the open, for anyone with a laptop and a ship tracker to see. On purpose, in a war zone, right as an enemy navy is threatening them over the radio. To understand why that single decision matters so much, you have to understand what these ships were actually sailing into. Naval officials had spent weeks calling the Strait of Hormuz a kill box. Not a choke point, not a contested waterway. A kill box, meaning anti-ship missiles, drones, fast attack boats, and sea mines, all packed into a channel so narrow that a missile fired from the shoreline barely needs 5 seconds to reach a target in the middle of it. No American warship had dared cross it since the war began in late February, until that Saturday in April, when two destroyers decided they would. This didn't come out of nowhere. Weeks earlier, the United States and Israel had launched a coordinated set of strikes deep inside Iran, hitting military and nuclear sites and killing Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, in the opening hours of the war. Iran's response was immediate. It shut the Strait of Hormuz entirely, turning off a fifth of the world's oil supply and roughly a fifth of its liquefied natural gas overnight. Shipping insurance rates on tankers heading anywhere near the strait jumped by hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage. Within weeks, more than 20,000 sailors and 2,000 ships were stranded across the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. This wasn't a regional dispute anymore. It was one of the largest disruptions to global energy movement in modern history. And it was happening because one government had decided to close a waterway that the entire planet depends on. So by the time those two destroyers approached the strait in April, the stakes weren't abstract anymore. Talks between the US and Iran had just collapsed in Islamabad, the first direct negotiations between the two countries in over a decade, and they'd ended without a breakthrough. No deal on the nuclear program, no agreement on the blockade, and almost immediately after those talks failed, the destroyers moved. A maritime history professor who studies exactly this kind of naval signaling put it simply afterward. You don't just accidentally turn your tracking system on. That was purposeful. They wanted the world to see them make it through. And they did make it through. CENTCOM later confirmed both ships operated in the Gulf and departed as planned without incident, describing the entire mission as a signal, a message that the United States does not accept Iran's claim over the strait. President Trump posted about it directly, saying the process of clearing the Strait of Hormuz for shipping had officially begun. Iranian state media told a very different version of events, claiming their forces coordinated the response with negotiators still in Islamabad, and that it was actually the American destroyers who backed off after being confronted. Two completely different stories about the exact same 20 minutes on the water, and to this day, there's no fully independent account of which version is closer to the truth. What isn't in dispute is what came right behind those two ships. A third aircraft carrier was already on its way to the region that same month. Thousands of additional Marines and paratroopers were inbound. Long-range cruise missiles were being resupplied through the island of Diego Garcia. Literal combat ships, the kind built specifically to hunt naval mines with underwater drones, were being pulled into the mix. This wasn't two destroyers making a lonely, symbolic run through dangerous water. It was the visible tip of a buildup that, by some open-source estimates, had already put nearly a third of the entire deployed U.S. Navy within striking distance of Iran, backed by enough Tomahawk cruise missiles in a single coordinated salvo to overwhelm almost any target on the Iranian coast. Now here's where it gets more complicated, because this story doesn't end with a clean military victory or a clean diplomatic one either. By mid-June, after months of strikes, counterstrikes, and a full U.S. naval blockade of Iran's own ports that reportedly cost Tehran close to $5 billion in lost oil revenue, both sides actually signed something. A real memorandum of understanding, negotiated with Qatar and Pakistan mediating, meant to formally end the war within 60 days. Trump signed it with Iran's president at a dinner in Versailles. The blockade was lifted. Tankers started moving through the strait again. For a moment, the story that started with the words, "This is the last warning," looked like it might actually be over. It wasn't. Because barely 2 weeks ago, Iran issued another warning, almost a mirror image of the one shouted over that radio channel in April. This time, it came from Iran's military command directly, telling every tanker in the region to follow only Tehran-designated routes through the strait, or face what officials called a forceful response. And in the exact same window, CENTCOM confirmed something else. The Boxer Amphibious Ready Group, an entire strike force built around the amphibious assault ship USS Boxer, carrying more than 2,000 Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, is now actively operating in the Middle East. Officially, it's described as a scheduled deployment, Unofficially, the timing lines up almost exactly with the same pattern this entire conflict has followed since February. Iran issues a warning. The United States answers not with words, but by moving ships into position. And there's a detail sitting underneath all of this that makes the entire picture even harder to read clearly. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who took over after his father was killed on the war's first day, still hasn't appeared in public. Not once. This entire war. His father's funeral is happening this week. Days of processions, specifically staged, by most accounts, to project strength and unity to the very governments responsible for his death. But the son, who's technically now in charge, issuing warnings and negotiating through intermediaries, remains unseen. Nobody outside a small circle in Tehran can say with certainty why. Indirect talks between the US and Iran did make what mediators called positive progress in Doha just days ago, with both sides expected to resume discussions once the funeral concludes. Iran's foreign minister has separately warned that any future attack from Israel would trigger what he called an immediate, powerful response, while also demanding Washington restrain its ally. So the diplomacy hasn't collapsed. It's paused, cautiously, waiting for a funeral to end before anyone sits back down at the table. Which brings this back to those two destroyers cutting through the strait with their trackers switched on, daring anyone to say they hadn't made it through. That single moment has become something close to a template for this entire conflict. A warning delivered in absolute terms. A response that doesn't retreat, but doesn't fire the first shot either. A signal sent, received, and immediately followed by another round of ships repositioning. Another warning, another pause. Nobody watching this closely, not the analysts, not the mediators in Doha, not even the commanders moving these fleets into place, can tell you with any real confidence whether the next warning ends in another quiet transit through open water, or in something the entire world will be watching unfold in real time. What's certain is that right now, in the waters closest to Iran, American warships are exactly where Tehran told them. Twice? Not to be.